Good morning. My name's Darrin Miller. I'm a security researcher at Cisco Systems. I'm here to talk to you about a paper that my co-author and I, Sean Convery, published on IPv6 and IPv4 threat comparison. So Nanog was gracious enough to allow us to come up and really just bring up an awareness about this paper and about this topic. We were motivated to do a threat comparison primarily as an awareness exercise for the security people within the enterprise. And so it's a little different to be getting up and talking to the operators for the SPs, but we thought it would be a good way to get feedback on the paper as well as look for other ways to expand the paper in order to document some early best practices for IPv6 security. And part of the motivation was that if you Googled IPv6 security, always referred to a section on IPsec. However, in many instances, there may not be the ability or the desire to deploy IPv6 with IPsec. So we really wanted to take a look at IPv6 security outside of IPsec. While IPsec brings lots of great benefits, it may or may not be something that's implemented within the next, 4 to 5 years on a wide scale, assuming IPv6 is. So we wanted to make people aware that this is a much broader topic than just IPsec, especially given a lot of the work that has been done within the IETF and documented there as well as other places. So what we did is we tried to map, have a one-to-one correlation between IPv4 security threats, which are very well understood by the enterprise security folks and the enterprise network operators, and map them with IPv6 security threats and see what the differences are. And also see if there are any new threats that are unique to IPv6. So after we did that, then we wanted to present some what we called candidate best practices, primarily because what we did find as far as best practices for implementing IPv6 security was pretty disparate depending on how people decided to implement IPv6 in correlation, in conjunction with their IPv4 networks. So we didn't have a good baseline to judge what a best practice would be for the industry. So we're actually, one of the reasons we're here is to solicit input if there are good best practices that you're using on the service provider side that could correlate to the enterprise side. So we have version 1. Just a note, version 1 already has things in it that need to be updated. Most significantly is the deprecation of site local and the proposed standard for local unicast. So there are things in the paper that need to be updated, and please, if you read it, it's great material to go to sleep by, but if you do read it, if you could just take into consideration that there are things in the IETF that have moved along since we published. So there's lots of attacks that don't change if you change the transport. So a couple examples of those, sniffing without without IPsec, the sniffing application layer attacks and how rogue devices gain access to an IPv4 network are very similar to IPv6. In addition, without IPsec, man-in-the-middle attacks don't really change except for how you manipulate the underlying protocol for things like address resolution for MAC to IP addresses. And then flooding attacks are exactly the same. There are some unique characteristics or new considerations that that enterprise network security people need to take into consideration. One of those would be reconnaissance. The way attackers and network security folks have done reconnaissance on their networks to find devices becomes very different in IPv6 just based on the pure size of the subnets. But in addition, there was some multicast addresses that are site-specific where we can find well-known services potentially. So the way you do reconnaissance slightly changes. As well with unauthorized access, really that's access control. It was our term to try to correlate, access control lists and firewalling to things that enterprise security folks understand. There's new reliance upon ICMPv6 to do address resolution, as well as some other things that the aggressive ICMP filtering policies that are prevalent in IPv4 networks, are going to need to change. In addition, there's new things like a packet too big in IPv6 becomes its own type rather than a subcode underneath. Another thing to make that particular path MTU discovery easier. In addition, because of the new headers, the extension headers that are introduced with IPv6, there's just new considerations on how to do filtering. Lots of people rely on stateless boxes to do filtering. Some of those stateless boxes have limitations on how far into the packet they can look to find upper layer protocol information, like layer 4 information. An attacker potentially could build a very, very, very long extension header change and push the upper layer protocol information up into a fragment that would obscure that stateless device from being able to inspect on layer 4 information. So it's nothing, earth-shaking, but it's something that people need to consider. And as well, fragmentation, while fundamentally changing that internetworking devices cannot fragment the packet, it still is a nice obfuscation method for attackers. So network IDS and firewall vendors and the operators need to understand that while fundamentally fragmentation changes, you still need to make sure that the reassembly is occurring correctly within your IPv6 devices. Then there's some new things with layer 3 and layer 4 spoofing. Nothing really new that, it's easy to do the spoofing. It's just that new attack vectors are introduced. This has been well documented in the IETF with some of the things such as the 6-to-4 relay, the spoofing. It's a new attack vector, but the ramification isn't as severe as some might think, because there's no amplification attack in the 6-to-4 spoofing attack, as well as there's a nice choke point in the 6-to-4 relay router itself. The DOS attacks can only really, and the spoof attacks can only really be as fast as the 6-to-4 relay. So ARP and DHCP attacks obviously change because ARP goes away. So neighbor discovery gets introduced and becomes the fundamental way to do resolution, as well as router discovery. The same issues with spoofing that existed in ARP can still be manipulated to be able to generate, man-in-the-middle attacks. I'm just waiting for the day when EtherCap adds IPv6, man-in-the-middle capabilities. But there is good work being done with secure neighbor discovery in the IETF. That's now a proposed standard so that we can secure the neighbor discovery process to prevent that. One of the nice improvements is that there is no directed broadcast in IPv6, so Smurf attacks as they were known go away. However, there is still a feasibility, depending on the protocol implementation on devices, for things like Fraggle attacks to be effective. So, all the best practices of turning on unnecessary services like UDP Echo still exist and are still potentially necessary. Then other things, routing attacks. I don't know if anybody was at the ISP BOF last night. IPv6 transport for OSPF v3 and RIP-NG specify that we should rely on IPsec for security, while BGP and ISIS maintain the MD5 authentication. There's, and I'll let other people comment on this because I'm not actively involved in this, but there seems to be a trend towards using IPsec to secure the control plane, and that's borne out with OSPF v3. Something that also changes with traditional worms and viruses is the propagation methodology that's generally used for virus propagation, or worm propagation, excuse me, is random scanning of IP address ranges outside of the local subnet as well as within the local subnet. Just because of the address space, that becomes an ineffective means to do propagation. So as IPv6 evolves, there's going to be new attack methods to gain a way to propagate these worms. There's a variety of different ideas that have been postulated, but nobody's really tested to see, things such as attacking peer-to-peer networks to make them do the propagation for you, doing propagation on a link local multicast, things of that nature. So that really becomes a research item, as we'll discuss later. And then the other thing that's a new consideration for the enterprise space primarily, and then I know the provider space has similar issues, is just that there's various techniques to do the transition from IPv4 to IPv6. And those transitions create more administrative complexity for the network security operators to understand. So inherently, you bring some new attack vectors. In addition to that, while IPv6 has a very, very heavy emphasis on getting rid of NAT, the best line I remember, and I can't remember who said it, was, reachability does not mean accessibility. While that is prevalent, some people that we've had discussions with already are planning on implementing NAT for IPv6 to IPv6 in some fashion. Now, I know that there's lots of people that are going to just go crazy with that statement. I personally think that that's an awareness issue, because you're just introducing more complexity into an already complex transition method. But it is something where, the reality is that people have become, in the enterprise space, have become very comfortable with their vendor just writing a new application gateway to deal with NAT. So their expectation at this point, without more education, is that they'll be able to do that similar function with IPv6. So, our summary findings with this paper were basically that IPv6 in some ways makes things better, in some ways it makes things worse because of either complexity or just a new attack vector. And in some instances, it's just different. ICMP for neighbor discovery is a perfect example. But there's no more or less security. It's primarily just different. So, some of the ways that it's better are, the worm propagation. Some of the ways it's worse is, lack of familiarity and lack of maturity of the OS implementations. And also, a lot of the legacy issues with IPv4 that really cause the issues, application layer vulnerabilities, it still exists in IPv6. For example, the ARP security issue is still there unless we move aggressively to secure neighbor discovery. While that's a proposed standard and has some very nice features, there's still a fundamental issue of how to do the public-private key cryptography on the end device in a scalable and manageable way, either within the enterprise or within an internet service. So a lot of people have felt that there needs to be more review of how to deploy that and move forward. So until that's reviewed and people agree on how to implement it, we still have, ARP spoofing like issues. So I just wanted to take a couple minutes to go over a couple candidate best practices. And again, we said these were candidates primarily because this was Sean and I discussing what were going to be some probably good things to do, as well as getting input from other people who've dabbled in the IPv6 in the enterprise space. While privacy extensions have a benefit that it keeps worms and viruses from being able to find you per se, they also limit the applicability of traceback within a sphere of domain or an administrative domain. So people should consider, what the advantages and disadvantages are of privacy extensions. Filtering, one of the pieces of feedback was about the granularity of ICMP-v4 filtering and how that correlates to ICMP-v6. That needs to fundamentally change how people operate that in the enterprise space. And then fragmentation reassembly still exists and is slightly different in IPv6. while the Smurf attacks go away, we still need to be aware that there may, and it is a may, be an amplification vector with some of the site local multicast addresses. And then we recommended that people implement hop limits to protect network devices. This was really put into the paper to bring awareness not only within Cisco but also within the enterprise space of the generalized TTL security mechanism as a way to help secure these infrastructure devices. So we wanted to put that out there as a candidate best practice in the IPv6 doc to also raise awareness in the IPv4 networks. I put out the paper 2 weeks ago, I think, for comments on Nanog. I received a few comments, one of them two comments to the list, and then a few unicast. The first comment was that the fonts were way too small and the lines were way too hard to read. So basically saying make this document a little easier to read because it was good bedtime material, if nothing else. Then ICMP filtering was unrealistic, was the other comment, and needed to have more unreachables. And I definitely agree with that statement. I will say that the sample ICMP filtering policy that was in the paper actually was given to us by one of my customers that I've dealt with quite a bit, and it's pretty indicative of the restrictive nature of ICMP filtering that lots of enterprises implement and drive people crazy with because they can't do path MTU discovery. And then we threw out one thing about fragmentation just to see if it would generate a good reaction, positive or negative, within the enterprise. And that was, there's a minimum MTU of 1,280 bytes within IPv6. And we said to ourselves, hey, it would be really neat that if we could just say, you know, if there's a fragment and it's the second packet, it'd be really neat to just be able to throw that away. Obviously, there's some fundamental issues with that statement in that we have to understand how each OS does fragmentation, whether or not it chunks off 1280 and then the remainder, or if it splits the packet evenly. But it would be really useful for a lot of the security devices if they could just get rid of a lot of the fragmentations reassembly that they have to do by just throwing away packets that are initial fragments that are less than 1,280 bytes. So moving forward, and the whole reason we're here talking to you today is we really want to try to improve IPv6 security from day one. Try to do some robust stack testing on not only our gear but some general implementations so that we can try to get rid of maybe some of the simple boundary conditions that were prevalent in the mid-90s with the IPv4 stacks. I'm primarily interested in doing that because a lot of embedded system vendors for process control networks are thinking about using IPv6 for their process controls. And if the stack implementation is not robust, we can have some very bad implications for process control equipment. So, SCADA for utilities and pipeline companies and things like that. So we really want to try to improve the IPv6 stack so that we can, as these critical infrastructures move to IP, that they can have a robust implementation. We also want to look to try to figure out how to expand the paper to be more relevant beyond just the enterprise focus that we had in the first paper, and try to integrate some service provider specific best practices or candidate best practices that could be implemented for IPv6. One of the thoughts we had, while this is a very nascent technology, is including either a new section or a whole new paper on mobile IPv6 security, which, there's lots of documentation about issues and considerations with mobile IPv6 that needs to be taken into consideration that's being done in the IETF, but that's not, generally accessible to a lot of enterprise security folks. They just don't follow IETF drafts that closely. And then other things that we'd like to do are identify future research areas. As I'd mentioned, worm propagation. We're going to probably do some research on amplification attacks to validate that, you know, we've thought through all the angles in IPv6 to rid ourselves of amplification attacks, and then, you know, the opportunity for input from the NANOG community to try to make this a more robust paper and a nice consolidated place for people to review IPv6 security issues outside of IPsec and understand the issue and, you know, raise the level of awareness. So that is my presentation, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them right now. Or, yeah, I'm happy to take them offline if anybody wants that. Well,
all right, I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time today.